So welcome to the Practice Management Study Club. Today's topic is Human Resources Management in Dentistry. It is being presented by Sandy Balarjan. Take it away, Devin.
Thanks a bunch, Jessica. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Sandy. Sandy is a leading authority on how to increase the effectiveness of dental business systems. She's author of 3 textbooks, Dental Office Administration, first and second edition, published by Top Hat Publishers, and the Canadian Dental Office Administrator, published by Nelson Canada. Sandy created the first certificate course in dental practice management at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Dentistry. Sandy has lectured at dental faculties across North America and has had articles published in many journals, including the Journal of Canadian Dental Association, Oral Health, Spectrum Teamwork, Just for Canadian Dentists, and many other publications. As owner-operator of Dental Office Consulting Services, Sandy specializes in dental practice management, consulting, hiring, coaching, and training, dental teams, implementation of office programs, dental business, and operational plans. Take it away, Sandy.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Devin. So tonight, just to start off with full disclosure here, I am an immediate family member of have any financial interest or affiliation with a corporation organizing, offering financial support or grant monies for or related to the content of my continuing education presentation as follows. So that's the full disclosure. So tonight we're going to talk about human resources in dentistry. As you know, as a dentist, your most valuable resource is your human resource system. And it's very important to not only hire carefully, but also to fire appropriately. So tonight we're going to talk about all of these things. So we're going to hire new staff, we're going to interview them, and go through the hiring process, and then we're going to immediately fire them, just to make the evening interesting. But doing either incorrectly can cost your practice a lot of money in valuable time and resources, for sure. So it's important to have an HR structure in place and to start off on the right foot with your new employees. And especially now with the crisis of a shortage of staff everywhere, that's one of the biggest problems. So it's important to hire carefully. And if you need to correct any behaviors, to correct them properly, and then to terminate if you need to do that, but that has to be done in a process as well. So tonight we're going to learn how to hire carefully, the importance of feedback, motivation, and leadership for team development, as well as to how to terminate when necessary, but do it the right way. So when you're hiring new employees, what could possibly go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. Dentists are generally hiring in crisis mode. Either someone has gone on maternity leave, or they've left, or they've moved, or they've changed jobs. What's happening right now in the job market is that a lot of dental office staff, there's a shortage of them to begin with, but they're demanding more and more money all the time, higher wages, and they're coming in with higher expectations. So hiring mistakes, it's very easy to make a hiring mistake. And I've done this on more than one occasion, unfortunately, myself. When I was managing an office, I hired a receptionist who had really displayed perfect behavior during the first 90 days of her employment. And I thought I did everything right in the hiring process. And then all of a sudden she turned into like Jekyll and Hyde on day 91. So it's hard to get to know somebody when you have an hour to really interview them and ask the right questions. And you've got to be careful on what questions you ask, because you can't violate any human rights, any of their human rights as well. So we'll talk about some of that tonight. I'm going to give you some ideas on questions that you can ask during a job interview, and also when you're doing reference checks, how to do a reference check properly, because you can run into a problem there as well with asking the wrong questions, or by because you can't prevent someone from getting another job. Even if they were not the best employee in the world, you have to be very careful on how you answer those questions. So hiring is easy enough. but firing is very difficult, and timing of the firing is extremely important as well. You can put your terminating employees can put you at risk if you do it incorrectly. So we begin with how to attract and retain quality team members. So starting off on the right foot, making sure you have an HR infrastructure in place. That's really important, and a solid foundation to build your dream team. The more your business grows, you need to maintain structure and consistency. So if you are planning on purchasing more offices, which seems to be a large trend right now, or if you have a large number of employees, then you want to make sure that you have a consistent HR system that will cover all of the offices, especially if you're a multi-practice owner. So you can pick your team members. You have to decide who will fit best with the team that you currently have. So some facts about hiring team members is dentistry has one of the highest rates of staff turnover in many industries, and that's absolutely true, and even more so now. What I'm finding now is when I'm interviewing staff or potential team members to join a particular practice, is taking a very long time, and then sometimes we'll go through the whole hiring process, hire them, and then they disappear. That's called ghosting, I believe it is. But anyway, so they won't show up, or they'll show up for a couple of days and then leave, because there's so much demand that they know that they can get higher wages at another practice. So they're continuing to keep looking. Some surveys suggest that it can cost up to 3 months production to replace one team member. What I'm also going to be talking about is each state and province in Canada and the US has rules that guide employment policies to ensure that employees are treated fairly without discrimination or bias, and that employers are following the rules to make sure that employees are being treated fairly. Employment require employers to, the employment laws, sorry, I missed a word there, require employers to follow the rules that protect the rights of employees. And that's really important. It's mandatory for all employers to comply with state or provincial laws. So we're going to talk about how to hire effectively, how to fire when necessary, which I've already mentioned. I just want to start with going through the tangible costs of staff turnover. So if you think of how much it costs for the web ads, and I've been using various platforms, and they are really expensive. And they go by the hour sometimes, they go by how long you've got it posted for, how many clicks there are. It's really, it can cost a lot. So make sure that you find out all of the hidden costs or what the true costs of that ad will be. And I would gauge it accordingly. What I've been doing is I will put it up for so long on a certain job website, and then if I'm not getting any reaction or I'm not getting really good reaction, then I will switch to another web job board. You've got to think about how much is it costing you and your manager's hourly wage spent screening applications, resumes, telephone or video interviews. That's what I'm doing, are video interviews, or personal in-time in-office interviews as well. All of that takes a lot of time, and I'm currently in the process of hiring for a couple of my clients, and it's difficult. Sometimes it can be a full day, and sometimes the applicants don't even show up for the video interview. So you know, you have to just be prepared for putting up with all of this. So how much once you hire somebody, how much of the manager's hourly wage is spent on orienting and training new employees? And it's usually anywhere from 8 to 16 hours. How many additional employees' time has been spent during that training time? And you usually have to multiply that by 2. One is to replace the person that you are hiring to replace, as well as the person that you eventually hire. The intangible costs of staff turnover, of course, are the effect on business. Being short one or more people at your office can cause people to get overly tired. Then they sometimes will get a little resentful, thinking, you know, I have to do all of this extra work. You know, why can't we just hire somebody? They don't necessarily realize how difficult it is. Then you end up with morale problems. And once morale problems set in, it can be very, very difficult to bring them back to a team-oriented atmosphere. Other priorities might be set aside. For example, if you are busy at the front desk and you know, the focus is on this, trying to maintain the schedule, there could be other things that are lagging behind, like your accounts receivable or things like that. Get overworked and tired employees, and that altogether is lost potential. So remember that hiring the wrong person can have a devastating impact on the morale and the motivation of team members, as well as production. That's really important. It's much more difficult and costly to your practice to have to terminate an employee. And if it's done incorrectly, they can come back and ask for more money or demand more money. And depending on how they've been terminated, they can generally get it. I know in Canada, at least, all of the, and I'm sure in the States as well, all of the employment laws favor protecting the employee. There are very little protections for employers. So that's why it's so important to have a good structure in place and infrastructure in place, and to make sure that it's followed consistently, that you do performance reviews. That's another very important thing, which I'll be talking about in just a few minutes as well. Also identify the type of person who would not fit well with your team. So I'll just give you an example of one of my hiring mistakes. I did all of this, and I interviewed this lady, and she was Susie Sunshine when I interviewed her. She was a certified dental assistant as well as a receptionist. And anyway, she was just perfect in my mind. She had really good credentials. One of her references gave me a kind of an ambiguous answer, which when I asked a question, and I didn't follow up with it. But thinking back, of course, hindsight is always 20/20. So we identified that. Then I had the doctor interviewer, and I even brought her in for a team meeting so she could meet the team, and I could get their opinion on her. And it still didn't work out, because during all that process, she was absolutely perfect. And then when she got started, there were some real behavioral problems that were, the important thing I'm going to tell you right now is to document everything, and make sure that it's dated as well. So make sure you keep all that documentation in the personnel files, because often times when I talk to a dentist, they will talk about something that happened in the office, and I ask them where they documented it, and it's not documented. So it's really important that you document dates, times, what was said, what happened. That's really important, because it's just like in your dental charts. If it's not in the chart, it didn't happen. So you've got to keep that in mind. Anyway, carrying on, we'll think of some red flags in resumes. Spelling and grammatical errors. You know, some employment people will tell you shouldn't really judge somebody on that, but really that's putting their best foot forward. So it shows to me that it's lack of attention to detail. I had a really good interview last week with a lady who she was applying for an office management job. And as it turns out, she seemed to have really good qualifications, but her resume was loaded with spelling errors. And you would just wonder, if she's applying for a management position, that she would at least have either use spell check or to have somebody proofread her resume. But anyway, it just showed lack of attention to detail. So consequently, that put the doctor off, and the doctor wasn't interested in her anymore. Gaps or overlaps in employment and education. If the dates are somewhat ambiguous, then you have to ask the questions. If there's vague or unclear data in the resume, for example, what their position and duties were, what their education was, or signs of instability. And this is what I'm seeing a lot now, is frequent job changes. That means they're going from job to job to job. And what that would indicate to me is, if something happened at this current job that made them unhappy for any reason, it looks like they would they would just leave and go on to another job. And in today's market, that's exactly what's happening. And because they can get another job that quickly. There could be conflicting dates in the resume, so it's important to ask all of these questions. And then set up an interview checklist. Now, I prepare a little package. I write down the questions that I want to ask. I have specific questions for admin team members, for clinical team members, and so I ask obviously different questions. But I've devised some specific questions that give me an insight into that person's personality a little bit. So get that all ready in advance. Make sure that you review the resume, highlight any gaps or areas that you need to ask the questions. So and I just generally highlight them, or I say, you know, why did you leave this job? I would write on the resume, and then prepare your questions. So get everything ready in the first place, and then schedule the interview. Now, I personally only schedule a half hour for each interview. I know that you should allow for more time, but I find that I've had a lot of no-shows. And when that happens, you don't want to waste your time to sit there. If somebody doesn't show up or they're late or whatever, you don't want to be sitting there forever. So I will send them an email and say, you know, I'm waiting on the line, because I do my videos through my interview through videos. And I'm waiting on the line, and then or I'll text them to find out, you know, what's happening. So some things you do need to do are prepare in advance, make sure that there is privacy, allow sufficient time. And as I say, I think 30 minutes is sufficient for the first interview. If you're ready to call them back for the second interview, you might want to allow more time. It's important to control and guide the interview. I have had some of my clients on the video interview for the second interview. And I found that sometimes the dentist, not always, but sometimes the dentist is more interested in selling you on the attributes of the practice rather than really getting to know that person and asking some and digging and getting some questions. Allow pauses in the conversation, so the person needs time to think. Watch for eye contact and body language. That's really important. And that's why I do it through video interview. I want to see, first of all, if they're dressed for success. In other words, you know, they're not sitting in their pajamas or or whatever. I realize we're in a Zoom world now, but the important thing is that they are serious about the interview, that they're well spoken, and that they are interested in the position itself. Try to personalize the questions as much as you can, so and that you get that right from their resume or job application, whichever you choose to use. Focus on and probe for clues in their behavior, and watch for the nonverbal cues. So for example, I was interviewing a lady for an office manager position, and this was an in-person interview. And when I was interviewing her, her eyes would be all over the place and not on me. And so, I mean, you don't want to stare at them. You don't want to intimidate somebody with too much eye contact. But on the other hand, it's natural, if you're interested in talking to someone, that there is eye contact. Plus it's more sincere. You can tell by a person's body language if they are telling the truth in a lot of cases. Clarify on any gray areas that you might see that don't make any sense. And then always conclude the interview on a positive note. Even if you know that that person is not suited for that job, I always conclude it on a very positive note. What not to do: do not ask yes or no questions, because you will get closed yes or no answers. Don't allow the applicant to ramble, and don't talk too much. And that's what I've found with sometimes with my clients, is that they will keep talking and almost selling their practice to the employee or potential employee. Don't cross-examine, argue, or become angry, because, you know, there's no point in that. Don't ask leading questions, and that's what we're going to cover. You have to be very careful with how you ask certain questions, and there's some questions you cannot ask. Do not express criticism. Do not ask any questions that lead an applicant to indicate race, ancestry, nationality, place of origin, color, creed, religion, age, marital status, or sexual orientation. You can't ask any of those questions, because those are all human rights issues. So there are questions that you may ask a candidate that are appropriate for the job and those that are not. It's important for the person hiring to be cognizant of presiding human rights code in their jurisdiction. I'll just give you another quick example. I was interviewing a male last week for a management position, and he indicated to me that the reason he left his last job was he had a serious car accident. So I could not ask him the nature of the injury or disability. Instead, I said, is there anything that would prevent you from being able to perform the job duties if you were to be awarded this position? He said, no. So that's all you can do. A human rights code provides every person with the right to equal and fair treatment with respect to employment. Since I brought up disabilities, in Canada, by 2025, you have to include in your advertisements something that we're willing to accommodate people with disabilities. So that's something that needs to be included in your advertisement as well, because by 2025, every employer must be compliant with people with disabilities, working with people with disabilities. Human rights don't usually arise from the intent of the question, but rather how the question is asked. It's legal to seek information regarding problems that might arise from job-related requirements, such as travel, long hours, or the need for specialized education. So at that point, that's why I asked that gentleman, is there anything that would prevent you from being able to perform the duties of this job? And he said no. So that was enough said. Don't make assumptions about a candidate's ability to meet requirements. That can also lead to human rights complaints as well. If sensitive area comes up during the interview, for example, if an applicant voluntarily provides information about dependent children, make it clear that this is not an issue when considering the applicant for the job. You certainly want to know that information if you can get it, but you can't ask for it. If the applicant wants to volunteer it, that's great, but you don't ask for it. So for example, if a woman brings up the fact that she has dependent children and states that she has plans to take care of them, then you do not ask what those plans are, because that's her information. And then do a quick evaluation of the employee. I usually write it right on the interview form if I'm using an interview form, or right on the resume. List what you feel are the positive and negative points for that candidate. Obtain a minimum of 2 references, and not written references. These are references that you can call. So if they're currently working, you're certainly not going to call their current employer, but if they have already left the job or they had a previous employment, ask if you could call their previous employer. If you are not completing a second interview, then you can proceed. If you know, in other words, that you're pretty sure you're going to hire this person, then go ahead and start checking the references. And you can use the reference check guidelines that are included with the course material, but I'll just show you what they are. And then it's always nice to send a rejection email, nicely worded, thank you for your application. We appreciate your time. This job has been completed, or this job has been filled. Here are the reference check questions that you can ask. Was the employee laid off, discharged, or did he or she resign? Was the employee punctual? Did the employee work well with your other team members? What were the number of sick days while employed with you? Well, was the employee flexible with job duties and working hours? And this is the most important question that you can ask the employer. So if the employer comes on the telephone and says, you know what, she was just such a great employee. Oh, I'm so sorry I lost her. I wish that she could have stayed forever. You know that it was a good employee. If the employer, I had one employer do this. He said, ask me the right questions. I said, okay, I'm just going to ask you one question. Would you rehire this person if the job was open again? And he said, no. I said, thank you very much for your time. That is enough said. Because you don't have to ask why, and there's no need to ask why. You just need to see if this person, if you had the chance of rehiring this person, then would you? And if they say no, you know that there's something up. But you can't rely on that entirely. You also have to rely on your instincts and the results of your job interview as well. Note the responses that were provided, and note any questions that the individual did not answer and why. So when that doctor said to me, ask me the right questions, he was sending me a clear signal that there was something he wanted to say but couldn't, because you legally cannot prevent someone from getting another job. That's a really important thing. And so that doesn't mean you give false references. It just means that they have to ask the right questions. End the discussion and thank the individual for his or her time. Never ask a question that you're unable to ask a candidate as per the human rights legislation. So that's pretty straightforward. So here's some sample interview questions that I like to ask. I always say, tell me about yourself, your background and experience, because I used to just say, tell me about yourself. And I've had various responses. One lady said to me, what do you want to know? And which I thought was really odd, because it was a job interview. So obviously I wanted to know her background and experience. So now I just put that right in the question. What computer systems are you familiar with? Describe your duties in your most recent position. This, I think, is really telling, because sometimes people will embellish on their resumes. And if they start talking about what their job duties were, then you can ask some questions related to what they did at their last position. How do you handle conflict? Now, I don't know if you've heard of DISC personality profiling, but I teach that as well. Anyway, I use this to determine what type of personality that person is. I'll just give you a real 10-second rundown on this. The personalities in this DISC profiling, everybody's a combination of different personalities, but in each one, when you ask how they handle conflict, each personality style handles conflict differently. So a direct personality or a D personality would handle it head on. An I personality would try to gloss things over a little bit because they're more interactive and influential. The S personality, and that's what I am, we like to keep things on a steady keel. So handling conflict, we want to gather the information. We're collaborators, so we want to make sure that we have enough information in order to solve the problem. And C personality would want to know all of the details, because the C is the conscientious one, and they need to know all of the details of everything. They're very detail oriented. So when I ask that question, depending on how they answer it, I can generally get a rough idea of how their personality is. And you want someone at your front desk who's very interactive. If you're hiring for a receptionist, if you're hiring for a dental assistant, you definitely want somebody who's conscientious. So, it depends on what your needs are. Anyway, I won't go into that any further. What do you like best about your current position? I like that question because it helps them to look at their positive aspects. I don't want to hear somebody complaining about their previous employer. I think that sends some very negative signals to me. So what do you like best? Do you like answering the telephone? Do you like interacting with the patients and that kind of thing? What challenges you the most? That's also another open-ended question, where they can tell me what challenges them most. And interestingly enough, when I was interviewing the office manager the other day with the spelling errors in her resume, she said, well, what challenges me the most is spelling. So at least she was honest about it. And then make the offer of employment. Once you have evaluated each candidate, identified the most suitable individual and verified any licenses if necessary, and that's always a good idea, to make sure if they are a certified dental assistant that you get them to bring in their certificate or a copy of their certificate, and then make a formal offer. Same with hygienists. You should do the same with hygienists as well. The offer letter is a formal agreement between the employer and the employee. It outlines the general terms and conditions of the employment agreement as well. The manager should prepare, sign, and review the offer with the candidate, and then provide the candidate time to consider the offer. So you wouldn't give the offer letter on the same day that they start. So that's important to remember. The letter should contain a welcome paragraph, job title, start date, salary or hourly rate, to who the employee reports to, and any procedures, what to expect on the first day. So this is just a sample of an offer letter. It just basically, the first paragraph is saying this is your offer for employment in this position, what the hourly thing is. You'll be entitled to 2 weeks paid vacation per year. Vacation will accrue at 4% per annum. Your specific duties, that will be in their job description. Your employment will be probationary. This is the most important thing. For the first 3 months during your probationary period, we will have an opportunity to assess your suitability for the position within the office. During your probationary employment, we may terminate your employment for any reason without prior notice or payment in lieu of notice. Now, this usually it has scared some employees, that you've just gone through the process of hiring, and then they see this, well, I'm going to get fired. You know, so it can be scary. I had one client who actually took that out. He didn't want it in his offer letter. He just wanted to welcome them to the practice, tell them what their job is, that they are probationary. Their employment is probationary, so they know that for 90 days. And that was absolutely fine. That's not necessarily a legal contract. And as you're aware, that you should have contracts prepared by employment lawyers, especially now after the pandemic, because employment laws have changed. They were changing, like it seemed like every 5 minutes in the beginning. They certainly have made some changes into leaves and things like that. So I would get it prepared by an employment lawyer for sure. Along with the offer of employment, the candidate should receive a copy of an employee handbook that outlines your policies and procedures in your office. This helps prevent any misunderstandings that may occur, and it delineates the personnel policies of the office. So it tells them exactly how they apply for vacation, what vacation they're entitled to, just various different things. So an employee handbook can actually help to protect your practice very similarly to employment contracts. It's not an employment contract, but it will just put in the terms of employment for your particular office. It provides a framework on how you want your office to be run, and it clarifies the expectations for your employees. It should contain policies that relate to your office, such as workplace health and safety, violence, how you handle violence and harassment. That's a very important thing that you have to have in there. That should also be in your health and safety program as well. How you handle progressive discipline. What is your vacation policy? How much notice do you expect them to give? Your policy on attendance and absenteeism, vacations and public holidays, sick days or personal days. Do you provide them or not provide them? And this can vary from state to state or province to province on whether or not you have to provide personal days. And especially now with the pandemic, because things have changed. Hours of work and overtime. Dress code is something very difficult to address once the employee has started. So it's very important to be clear on how you want that person to be dressed. Are they going to be wearing scrubs, for example? Are they wearing scrubs at the front desk, or would you prefer them to wear business attire at the front desk? And if so, then you need to define what you mean by business attire, because there are many interpretations on what casual dressy casual is. So just make sure that you clearly define how you want your office image. How you do performance reviews and when you do performance reviews, and much more. So all new hires and existing employees should be directed to read the employee handbook and sign a letter that says that they have read it and that they've had an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a manager at your office, your manager can sit with them while they're going through the employee handbook and answer any questions that they have. The employee handbook represents the terms of employment for all of your employees at your office, and it helps to prevent any misunderstandings, and it also provides clarity. Should you have employment contracts? Absolutely yes. Employment contracts protect the employer and the employee as well, but more so the employer this time. Employment laws may have some minor differences depending on the state or the province that you're located in. Employment Standards Act in Canada is the minimum entitlement if you need to terminate an employee. So for example, it's usually 1 week per year worked, up to a maximum of 8 weeks. But keep in mind, that's the minimum standard. If you are terminating somebody, if let's say you're purchasing a practice and you're terminating the other employees who have employment contracts, that's the bare minimum that you have to give, but it's strongly recommended that you give more than the minimum, and then there's less likelihood of the employee coming back to ask for more money. In Canada, the common law may award 1 month per year of service and more for more extenuating circumstances like the age of the employee, for example. Employment contracts will limit the liability to the doctor to the Employment Standards Act. So in other words, if you are purchasing a new practice, another practice from an existing employer, I would ask them if they have employment contracts in place, because of the fact that if you have to terminate, now usually you like to keep the employees that have been there for a long time, but however, you may have to terminate somebody at some point. If they don't have employment contracts, then you have just inherited the length of service from the previous employer. Excuse me. So if for any reason you needed to terminate that employee, then you would be liable for paying them all of that severance for the length of term that they worked with the other employer. So employment contracts should contain things like a non-disclosure agreement, a non-solicitation agreement. So in other words, they can't go to, if you had a hygienist and then go to the work next door, the employer next door to you, then the non-solicitation will prevent them from saying to your patients, you know, come to this practice. I'm now working out of this practice right next door. Come and see me next door. It will prevent it. Something you can't put in employment agreements are things like, I can't think of the word. It's a radius. You can't prevent them from working within a certain radius. Restrictive covenant. And the reason for that is because you cannot, as an employer, cannot prevent your employee from working anywhere. So although some employers have wanted to put a restrictive covenants in, you can't do anything about them. They're not, I don't believe they're enforceable by law. But again, check with an employment lawyer. I'm not an employment lawyer. I know a lot about employment standards, but you're always best checking with an employment lawyer on that to make sure that you're doing the right thing. But I would say in general, just don't put restrictive covenants in your contracts. Might be different with an associate, but you can talk once again to your lawyer about that. Put references in there to your employee policies manual, because that's where you have some leeway. You have some flexibility if you need to make changes. So for example, when the Employment Standards Act was changing during the pandemic, that's where the flexibility was in the employee policies manual. So the offices that had contracts didn't necessarily have to get new contracts. And have lots of references to the Employment Standards Act, because that's the minimum standards that you need to abide by. If you don't have a written contract, the employees are working under the common law, certainly in Canada. If you wish to terminate an employee, you may be obliged to provide 1 month's notice for each year of service, which I've already mentioned. The courts will also take into consideration the employee's age and their ability to get a similar employment with similar to what they currently have. Having contracts will increase the value of your practice for the simple reason that if you are trying to sell your practice, it will limit the liability of the new owner. If they did have to terminate someone, then they don't have to get into expensive severances, that they can follow the minimum of the Employment Standards Act. But as I say, always pay a little bit more than the minimum, or at least more than the minimum. Job descriptions, it's very important that your employees understand what their job description is. I use job descriptions for 2 reasons. One is if I'm restructuring in an office, it's very important to have job descriptions so each employee understands what they're accountable for. The other reason is that what I literally do is I take the job description, I cut and paste their duties and responsibilities into a personnel profile. And that's what you would use as the basis of your performance review. It's very important to do performance reviews because, as I said earlier, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if you have an employee that you're having difficulty with, then the first thing that the labor board or an employment lawyer will ask is what was on their performance reviews. Show me their performance reviews. So, and the reason for that is that if the employee has no idea that they were not performing well, they can go to an employment lawyer and say, you know what, I had no idea. The doctor never told me whether I was doing well or not, or never told me I was doing anything wrong either. And so I got terminated unjustly, and they would likely win. It's important to have standardized job descriptions that are linked to your operating policies and procedures. This will help to maintain consistency in your practice. For example, I find that when you're hiring experienced staff, their experience coming from other offices, they might have developed some workarounds at other offices, or they might have developed some bad habits. So you want to make sure that whoever comes into your office, that they are trained on that exact position, and they're trained according to your policies and procedures. You should customize them for your practice and maintain a copy in the employee's file. I always say it's a good idea to update the job descriptions annually when you're doing your performance reviews, to have a look at them. Make sure that they still make sense, because a lot of people's positions will evolve over time. Not so much with the clinical staff, they're pretty straightforward, but certainly with the admin team, their positions can evolve and change. Make sure that you take them through, the new employee, through occupational health and safety training. It's mandatory to be compliant with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Have the employee sign off on the training sheet. Ensure that the employee knows what to do in the event of an emergency. And I'd say this is very important for temps as well. When you have a temp in your office or somebody covering maternity leave, you have to make sure that they understand what your safety procedures are and your emergency exits are, and that kind of thing. WMIS training, everybody has to be WMIS on workplace health, hazardous materials information training. Now that's has now changed to globally harmonized system, which is GHS, and that is the reason for that is, just as the name implies, is so that globally the symbols are easy to read and understandable in any language because they're symbols. Safe operating procedures and infection control, that's extremely important. Keep your personnel records up to date always, including the resume. If you had a long-term employee, you may not have the resume anymore, but make sure that you have their payroll records, any performance agreements. If you have performance agreements, in other words, where you want your employees to meet certain targets, that would be considered a performance agreement. Any progress reports, that would be your performance reviews, and the annual performance reviews as well. These are so important because it's a critical step in your practice growth and employee empowerment. Your employees need and want feedback. I can't tell you how many practices I've been in where the doctor has been a little bit reluctant to do these, and yet the employees are saying to me, I don't know whether I'm doing a good job or not. I never hear from the doctor's too busy. So it's important that you are able to give them one-on-one attention at least once a year. They don't have an opportunity to receive any feedback during the day or week because it's a must in any good relationship. Many dentists will avoid this or don't know basically how to do it. I always say as I said, to put the job description step by step in the personnel profile, and that way you are evaluating your employee on exactly what they do on a daily basis. And that gives your employees comfort as well. Base salary increases on objective data, such as did they meet or exceed their goals, and what is the profitability of the practice. So it's very important that you don't just give salary increases because it's been 3 years, so they haven't had a salary increase. That's not good enough determination to give a salary increase. Salary increases must be based on merit of performance. So they should only be awarded when the person has demonstrated their value to the practice and their consistent ongoing positive behavior. A performance review does not necessarily mean a raise will be given. Too often the expectation is that if I have a performance review, And you have to think about it from your employees' perspective, because your employees think that they are doing a really good job. They're giving 110% every time they come to your office, and they work very, very hard. But there may be things that you are not necessarily 100% happy with. So this is your opportunity to make any corrective behaviors is during the performance review. Pay increases should only be awarded when the employee meets or exceeds their performance statements as outlined in their job description. Pay increases should be based on merit and decided upon by the doctor. And it's often good. I always tell my clients to start doing your performance reviews just before you do your annual budget, if you're doing an annual budget. But my clients do an annual budget. So when you're doing your budget, that way you know that you have the money in the budget to award salary increases. If you have like superstar employees and you want to give them a raise because they've been doing really, really well. Do not reward an underperforming employee, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Employees often think that they're entitled to pay increases, that you should simply give it to them because they've worked there a year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever, and that you are obliged by law to provide an increase annually. That's not true. That's not the case. You're not obliged. Pay increase is awarded based on merit of performance, and that's the key thing, and that's why the performance reviews are so critically important. You only need to comply with the minimum standards under the Employment Standards Act. Pay increases must be based on merit of each employee's performance. If an employee is eligible for a pay increase, it shouldn't go into effect until the employee, of course, has worked there for 1 full year prior to the increase, and there's no interruption of earnings. So for example, if they went on maternity leave, then you wouldn't necessarily give them a pay increase. You have to bring them back at what they were making, but because you can never go the other way. You can't go down in salary, you can only go up. Wage adjustments will be based on the merit of each individual's performance, and raises, if applicable, will be given based on the results of the practice performance too. You have to have the money in the budget, and you have to be making money in the budget in order to award salary increases. Bottom line is, do not reward poor performance. This is extremely important. If you have a poorly performing employee, do not provide a salary increase, because, and this includes bonuses as well, they can then go to the labor board or an employment lawyer and say, I didn't know I was doing a bad job. My boss never gave me any feedback. And by the way, I got a raise. You know, so if you're giving across the board increases to everyone in the practice, and you give it to this poorly performing employee, and then you have to discipline them or terminate them, then it will come back to bite you, because that they can go to an employment lawyer and they'll win, because they didn't know that they were doing a bad job and you had no documentation. So documentation is the key. Dates, times, what the performance was. And if you find that somebody is really not performing well, then you need to set a performance improvement plan for them, so they have an opportunity to improve. Because if they don't know if they're doing anything wrong, then they have no opportunity to improve. And that can also cause a problem for the employer as well. The labor board may ask to see the performance reviews for each of the employees as well. An employee who is performing below standards should be provided with a performance improvement plan that specifies the areas, and be very specific about the areas that require improvement, and then give a reasonable time frame to make the necessary adjustments. And I always tell office managers, during that time frame, please follow up with the employee. Don't just let if it's 60-day time frame, don't just let the 60 days pass and then say, oh, by the way, you're still not doing it right. You know, follow up with the employee, offer them the help and support and training that they need, and help them to meet your expectations. Should an employee not meet the expectations of their role, opportunities for improvement will be discussed with them, and the individual will be provided with the time frame in which to display visible and consistent improvement. The employee will be given written guidelines to follow, and their progress should be closely monitored during this time as well. No pay adjustments will occur during this process or reevaluation and monitoring. So what if you made a mistake hiring? This can happen. It's happened to me. Always include a minimum 90-day probationary period that may be extended according to your needs. However, I've spoken to the labor board on this a few times because I've had employers who wanted to extend the probationary period, and the answer from the labor board was, yes, you put in whatever probationary period you want. However, we will only recognize 90 days. So during that 90 days, when you have a new employee, that's your time to train and evaluate. So that, keep in mind that that 90-day time frame is really important. And that's built in for protection of the employer, just in case you did make a mistake. Recognize the problem quickly and take action to make the correction. Provide employees with a specific target date to show improvement and be very clear about what your expectations are. So if you must terminate, then have a progressive dismissal policy in place and process in place. In other words, give a verbal warning with the witness. And that witness, by the way, cannot be a spouse. That's a really important thing to remember, because then the employee can say, I go to an employment lawyer and say, you know, they were ganging up on me. It was a husband and wife team. So it cannot be a spouse. Written warning signed by the employee. And usually what I've found in my experience is once that written warning or performance improvement plan is in place, if the person really truly wants to improve and didn't know that they were doing things wrong, they will follow the guidelines in the performance improvement plan. If it's worded in such a way where it's a warning, then generally they'll quit at that point. But in most cases, they'll quit after step 2. You're not required to give notice or termination pay if they're fired for willful misconduct, disobedience, willful neglect of duty that's not condoned by you. If the employee was hired for a specific length of time, so in other words, a time-bound contract, or loss of employment because of unexpected flood or fire. Some examples of termination with cause, you can find this in your either your state legislations or the Employment Standards Act. But things like open disregard for the rules of the office, harassment of any team member, that's a really important point in there. Consistent poor reviews, theft, commission of drug-related offense or use of illicit drugs or alcohol on the premises, or attending work under the influence of alcohol. And I've had that, not with me, but I've had that circumstance in 2 offices now where somebody has had an alcohol problem and they've attended work. One was a hygienist. They've attended work with under the influence of alcohol. Breach of professional ethics, and so on and so forth. You can tell that these are very, very egregious acts. So it's also very serious. It's very difficult to terminate somebody with cause. An employment lawyer once told me, she said, you have to have a smoking gun and the victim, the dead body, and a videotape, and the videotape will be challenged in court. So it's just important to follow the progressive dismissal processes and do it correctly. Make sure that the person has an opportunity to improve as well. If you're hiring private contractors, there are some areas, I find this in my experience, it's been sometimes a hygienist will want to work as a private contractor. I've had this happen a couple of times. I advise my clients against it. Your employees should be your employees because it's too complicated with hiring a private contractor. And the person who will get dinged is you, the employer. So the employer will get stuck with paying all the back taxes plus paying any penalties because the employment standards, the labor board assumes that you should have known better. You should have known to not hire a private contractor because if you set that person's hours, they're an employee. If they are not renting a chair from you, they're an employee. If they have to bring in their own instruments. And then there's also this tricky little issue, and that's who does the chart belong to? Does it belong to the private contractor or does it belong to the employee? Yeah, the employee. So in our area in Canada, if in the US it's IRS, but in here it's CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. If they assume that an employee-employer relationship exists, then they are considered an employee. So the employer, that means that you must withhold the appropriate payroll deductions and submit them to Revenue Canada or to the IRS. For example, income tax, CPP, employment insurance. You may work as a private contractor if you provide a written documentation from CRA or the IRS in the US that allows you not to take source deductions. And that's a very dangerous thing because then you're on their radar. I don't recommend it. A copy of their business registration is not enough. If you simply, if you don't take them, then you're subjecting yourself to financial risk. What happens when a dentist is selling his or her practice to a new owner? The vendor should terminate all staff or implement employment contracts. But I would suggest doing that 3 to 5 years before you decide to sell. A new employment agreement must be entered under the terms and conditions of the new owner. Otherwise, the purchasing dentist is responsible for the length of service for each of the employees with their previous owner. So if you had to terminate somebody, then you would have to pay them all that severance because you're inheriting their length of service. If any of the employees need to be terminated, the new owner is responsible for all of the back severance owing to the employee. So in summary, what we've talked about is how to hire effectively, how to fire when necessary, and some general keys. There's a lot more involved, but some keys to compliance with employment laws.